All right, get ready, because today we're diving into a world you might not expect. Crane rental.
Brains.
Yeah, we're talking about those massive machines, ones doing some serious heavy lifting. And the company we're focusing on is Sanghvi Movers Limited. They're a global player in this industry.
Interest.
So if you want to know how this business works and what their latest financial results tell us, you've come to the right place. We've got their official press release. It's hot off the
Oh,
presses.
nice.
And we've also got their in-depth investor presentation. So we've got a lot to dig into.
Sounds good.
Get ready for some surprising facts. Like, did you know some of these cranes can lift an incredible amount of weight, like a
I
whole herd of
did.
elephants?
I really?
Oh, yeah. We're going to uncover all sorts of things, like where these mechanical giants are working around the world, what Sanghvi Movers Limited has planned for their future. Trust me, they're thinking big.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Sanghvi Movers Limited because they're headquartered in Pune, India,
Yeah.
and they just released these financial results yesterday, November 14th, 2024.
Okay.
It was for the quarter that ended on September 30th. So we're going to be looking at their performance for the quarter and the first half of their fiscal year 2025. This is going to give us a really good sense of where they stand.
Okay, so let's get into it. From what I'm seeing in the press release, their overall performance seems pretty strong. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. One of the first things that really jumps out at me is their profit after tax, or PT as it's often called.
Right.
For the first half of the fiscal year, it was a whopping 70 crore rupees. To put that into perspective for everyone, that's a significant increase compared to the same period last year. It suggests they're on a solid growth trajectory.
70 crore rupees, that's impressive.
hmm
But I noticed something in the investor presentation. The first half of the year looks great, but their second quarter performance seems a bit subdued compared to the first quarter. What happened? Did they hit a snag?
It's a good observation. While the second quarter did see a slight dip, it's important to consider the context. Their performance is actually on par with the same period last year. Now, the investor presentation does mention something called structural or systemic issues, and they say these issues are impacting project execution and leading to delays. We'll dig deeper into those challenges a little bit later, but it's worth noting that these issues seem to be impacting the entire industry. They're not specific to Sanghvi Movers Limited.
Okay, so some external factors might be at play. Got it. Let's look at some other key figures from their investor presentation. One that caught my eye was their average capacity utilization. It's sitting at a pretty healthy 73%. What does that tell us?
That's a great indicator of how well they're using their crane fleet. Basically, it means that on average, almost three-quarters of their cranes are actively out there working on projects. That's a pretty good sign of a busy and efficient operation.
It makes sense. Another figure I found interesting, but honestly I need a little help understanding, is their average blended yield per month. It was 2.09%. So what does yield actually mean when we're talking about crane rental?
That's a good question. Yield in this business refers to the revenue that's generated each month for every crane that's deployed. So that 2.09% figure means that for every 100 rupees invested in a crane each month, they're earning 2.09 rupees back. It's a measure of how well they're turning their assets, those big cranes, into profits.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's all about maximizing the return on these big investments. Speaking of which, let's talk about their order book. It's a pretty amazing 898 crore rupees. That's a huge signal of future revenue, right?
Absolutely. And if you look closer at the investor presentation, they've even broken that order book down by sector. So that gives us even more insight into where the demand is coming from. Looks like windmill, power, and refinery and gas projects are keeping them very, very busy.
Okay, so we've been tossing around these big numbers, but I have to ask, what kind of cranes are we actually talking about? Are these the ones you just see at a normal construction site, or are we talking about something even bigger?
Oh, much bigger. Think colossal. The CapEx section of the investor presentation has some information on their fleet. In just the first half of this year, they purchased 18 new cranes.
Wow,
That includes 10 cranes that can each lift 160 tons.
that's a lot.
And they even added two massive cranes to their fleet. These cranes can lift a mind-blowing 800 tons each.
Wait, 800 tons. To put that into perspective, that's like trying to lift the Statue of Liberty. What are those massive cranes used for?
Those are for really big infrastructure projects. These are the projects that power our world, things like power plants, refineries, bridges that span miles. They need those really big cranes to lift and place the enormous components that make those projects possible.
It's incredible to think about the scale of those projects and the engineering behind them. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about Sanghvi Movers Limited's future plans. They've got some pretty interesting business growth initiatives outlined in the investor presentation.
They do, and they're not being quiet about their ambitions at all. One phrase that caught my eye was Engine 2 growth opportunities. What does that even mean?
Engine 2. That does sound pretty interesting. I mean, what does that mean for crane rental? It almost sounds like it's out of a sci-fi movie.
It's actually a clever way to describe their strategy. Basically, they're saying, hey, we're awesome at crane rental, but we're not stopping there. They're looking to grow beyond their core business and find new ways to grow. They call these core adjacencies.
Okay, so what kind of core adjacencies are we talking about? What else could they possibly offer besides renting out these huge cranes?
Well, that's the big question, right? It's one that Sanghvi Movers Limited seems to be exploring themselves. They could potentially offer all sorts of related services that would go really well with their crane rental business. Things like specialized transportation,
Interesting.
rigging, even project management expertise.
Okay, so it sounds like they want to become a one-stop shop for all things heavy lifting.
Potentially, yeah.
I also noticed that they're spinning off their wholly owned subsidiary, Sangreen Future Renewables Limited. They're even bringing on a new COO and giving this venture a dedicated staff.
Hmm.
It seems like they're pretty serious about renewable energy, particularly wind energy.
Absolutely. And this move shows their commitment to carving out a space for themselves in the renewable energy sector. And remember all those windmill projects they had in their order book? Well, this spinoff is going to allow them to really focus on wind energy, and it'll help position them as a leader in this rapidly growing market.
It's so fascinating how a company that started out just moving heavy stuff is now playing a role in, well, lifting the future towards cleaner energy. It's not just about brute strength anymore. It's about enabling a more sustainable future.
Absolutely.
Now, I also noticed that they mentioned the GCC in their investor presentation, the Gulf Cooperation Council. Are they hinting that they're looking to expand their operations?
I think you're right. The GCC region is a hotbed of infrastructure development and energy projects, and it makes it the perfect place for Sanghvi Movers Limited to expand. They've definitely got their eyes on the construction and energy sectors in those Gulf countries, and it makes perfect sense considering their expertise and the growing demand in that region.
So they're strategically positioning themselves where the growth is.
Yeah.
And to top it all off, they've brought in management consultants to help them optimize their business and achieve their 5-year vision. I mean, they're setting themselves up for major growth, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. They're being proactive and adapting to a changing global landscape. They're not just adapting to it, they're helping to shape it. But of course, with any ambitious plan comes challenges and, of course, opportunities.
Right? Like those structural or systemic issues we talked about earlier that are delaying these EPC projects. What are those exactly?
Well, the investor presentation doesn't really give us specific details, but we can guess based on the industry.
Okay.
These issues could be anything: bureaucratic hurdles, permit delays, disruptions to the supply chain, or even just fluctuations in the prices of raw materials.
Mhm.
EPC projects are really complex. They involve engineering, procurement, and construction, and they often have so many different stakeholders.
So that sounds like navigating all of that can be really tricky, especially with the world changing so fast.
Precisely. But even though there are all those challenges, there's also a silver lining. The investor presentation talks about how OEM companies have really strong order books. These are the original equipment manufacturers. They're the ones that actually supply all of the equipment for these large-scale projects.
So what does that mean for Sanghvi Movers Limited? Is that good news or bad news?
I think it's potentially very good news. It suggests that even though there might be some delays in those early phases of the EPC projects, there's a whole lot of work just waiting to be done. And once those OEMs start delivering the equipment and those projects start moving forward, Sanghvi Movers Limited is going to be perfectly positioned to capitalize on that surge in demand for their services. I mean, they're going to have the cranes, the expertise, and the right partners to ride that wave of growth.
So it might be a bit of a waiting game, but it sounds like the future is really bright for Sanghvi Movers Limited.
It really does. They've got great financials, a clear vision, and the ambition to be a global force in this industry.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive so far. We've explored their really impressive financial performance, talked about their amazing fleet of cranes, and uncovered their plans to grow. But there's still so much more to discover.
There is. Join us in part 2, where we're going to take a deeper dive into Sanghvi Movers Limited's financials, break down those numbers, and really uncover what they tell us about their future. We'll also look at what their strategy means for the crane rental business and the renewable energy sector, which is changing all the time. Welcome back to our deep dive into Sanghvi Movers Limited.
Now, in part one, we got a taste of their impressive performance. 70 crore rupee profit. That's incredible for just the first half of the year. But I'm really interested in digging deeper into the numbers. What else can we learn from these financials?
Yeah, let's do it. When you look past the headlines, you start to see some interesting things. Like their total income for the first half of fiscal year 2025, it was 335 crore rupees, and that's up from 297 crore rupees during the same time last year.
Okay, so revenue is clearly going up.
Yep.
But are they just getting bigger or are they also becoming more efficient?
That's the important question, isn't it? You want to know if they're managing their growth but also maintaining profitability. And when we take a closer look at their PAT, their profit after tax, it's definitely increased. It went from about, let me see, 79 crore rupees in the first half of last fiscal year up to that impressive 70 crore rupees this year.
So even with that dip in the second quarter, their overall profitability is still really strong. I feel like there's a but coming, though.
Haha, you know me too well. While their profit is up, their revenue growth is even stronger,
I see.
which might mean their profit margins are being squeezed a bit, something to watch out for as they grow.
Interesting. So it's not just about celebrating those big wins. It's about understanding what the numbers are really telling us. How do we get a better handle on their efficiency? Where do we look next?
One of the best places to look is their EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That gives us a much clearer view of their operating profitability without all those other things factored in.
Gotcha. So what does their EBITDA tell us?
Well, for the first half of this fiscal year, their EBITDA is a healthy 176 crore rupees, which works out to a 52% EBITDA margin. Basically, for every 100 rupees they're bringing in, 52 rupees are left over as profit before you account for things like interest and taxes.
52 rupees. That's more than half. I'm seeing why you call their EBITDA healthy.
Yeah.
But how does this compare to other companies that do crane rental? Is this good or is this just normal?
That's the million rupee question. Unfortunately, we don't have those industry benchmarks handy right now. But generally, a margin over 50% is pretty solid, suggests they're managing costs well and have a good grip on their operations.
Makes sense. So they're making money, their margins seem good, but are they taking on too much risk to get this growth? I'm thinking about all those new cranes they're buying.
That's a smart thought. One way to check their financial risk is looking at their debt-to-equity ratio. This tells us how much debt they're using compared to their equity. A high ratio can be a red flag, but right now, Sanghvi Movers Limited's ratio is a very manageable 0.29.
So they're not over-leveraged. That's a good thing, right?
Yes, definitely positive. Means they've got a solid base and aren't relying too much on debt to grow. Gives them more room to pursue those Engine 2 opportunities we talked about without taking crazy risks. They want to expand into new services and markets, so having a healthy balance sheet is essential for that.
It's like setting at a good base camp before trying to climb Mount Everest, not rushing in. Speaking of growth strategy, we touched on their CapEx, their capital expenditure, in part one. They spent a lot on those new cranes. How much are we talking?
They invested about 89 crore rupees to get 18 new cranes. That's some serious muscle added to their fleet. Fits right in with their goal of getting a bigger piece of the crane rental market, especially as all these infrastructure projects are ramping up globally.
It's interesting, though, they're not just buying cranes. They're also investing in boom lifts and inserts, other equipment, too.
Right. They spent about 26 crore rupees on that stuff. Shows they're thinking strategically. They're not just a crane company. They want to offer more services, become a real solutions provider for their clients, especially in that demanding EPC market.
Like they're building a Swiss Army knife for heavy lifting, ready for anything. Can't forget about those structural systemic issues delaying projects, though. Need to understand how that impacts their bottom line.
Absolutely. Remember, those delays mainly affect their EPC projects, the more complex ones, very sensitive to things outside their control. It's not just about having the cranes ready. It's about dealing with approvals, permits, all those stakeholders.
So even with a full order book, turning those orders into actual revenue might take longer than they hoped. How do we interpret that when we're looking ahead?
It's a factor for sure, but remember that silver lining, those OEM companies having strong order books. That means there are tons of projects just waiting to happen. Good news for Sanghvi Movers Limited in the long run.
So once the equipment starts arriving and projects get going, they'll be ready to get to work. They're in a good spot to benefit from that demand.
Exactly. It's all about timing. And while they're waiting, they're being smart with their money to make sure they're ready.
What do you mean smart with their money?
Look at where they're putting their cash. A big chunk of it is going into short-term mutual funds, corporate bonds, things like that. Relatively low-risk ways to make their money work for them while staying flexible.
So they're keeping their options open, ready to act when the time is right. Playing the long game, which seems wise in such a dynamic market.
Couldn't agree more. And they're not just sitting around. Remember those management consultants? Helping them streamline, become more efficient, all part of that ambitious long-term vision.
Optimizing everything, making sure they're lean and ready to scale up when the time comes. I'm seeing a pattern. Sanghvi Movers Limited is very calculated, very strategic. They're not reacting, they're anticipating and getting ahead of things.
Spot on. Calculated risks, smart investments, building a strong foundation for the future.
But even with the best plans, there are always bumps in the road. What kind of challenges could they run into as they're going after these goals? What could trip them up?
Navigating the EPC world is tough. We've seen how delays happen, and that can really mess with their revenue timing. Got to stay agile, manage those risks well, and be ready to adjust if needed.
Being flexible is key when things are always changing. What about competition? This market is growing, so there are going to be new players, more pressure from the ones already there. How does Sanghvi Movers Limited stay on top?
It's a real concern. They have to set themselves apart. Keep offering the best service, invest in the newest equipment, and build strong relationships with clients.
So building that reputation for being reliable, innovative, and customer-focused, that's going to be key to stay competitive.
You got it. This is a marathon, not a sprint. They have to prove they're the best over the long haul.
Well, we've covered a lot. We broke down their financials, looked at how they invest, and explored their growth plans. Even peeked into their plan for handling challenges. I feel like I'm starting to understand this industry a bit better.
It's quite a journey, isn't it? And we're not done yet. Join us in part 3, where we'll dive into the fascinating world of crane specs. We'll explore the engineering behind those massive machines and take a closer look at what's happening globally with heavy lifting and infrastructure development. It's a world of giants and innovations, so you won't want to miss it.
Welcome back. We've spent some time digging into Sanghvi Movers Limited's financials, their strategy, those ambitious plans they have. But now it's time for the main event.
What's that?
The cranes themselves. Gotta admit, I never thought much about cranes before all of this. But these machines are mind-blowing, the size, how complex they are.
Yeah, they really are incredible feats of engineering. And Sanghvi Movers Limited's fleet, really something special. They've got a crane for every job you can imagine, each with different lifting power, different things they can do.
We talked about those 800-ton cranes earlier, remember? The ones they added. Can you even paint a picture for us? How big are we talking?
Okay, try to picture this. A crane so tall, it makes a skyscraper look small. And a boom, that arm part, reaching hundreds of feet up in the air. Even just the hook block, the part that grabs the load, that can be the size of a car.
A car dangling hundreds of feet up. Whoa. What kind of projects even need that much power?
The really big ones. The ones that are super complex, power plants, those huge oil refineries, those bridges that go on forever over rivers, even oceans. Those projects need these monster cranes to lift the massive pieces, things like reactor vessels, bridge sections, those gigantic wind turbine blades.
Oh yeah, the wind turbines. Sanghvi Movers Limited is going big into renewable energy, especially wind. What part do the cranes play in building those wind farms?
Cranes, they're essential. I mean, think about trying to build a wind turbine. Those things are huge, hundreds of feet tall without a crane. The cranes lift and put together all those tower sections, the nacelle, that's where the generator is, and then those massive blades that catch the wind.
It's kind of poetic, isn't it? A company that started with moving really heavy things is now helping to literally build a cleaner future. It's not just muscle anymore. It's about sustainability.
I like that. And their expertise makes them perfect for this. As the world builds more renewable energy, Sanghvi Movers Limited is right there. They're moving those heavy objects, but they're also moving us toward a better future for the planet.
We've been talking a lot about India. That's where they're based. But it's clear their goals are much bigger than just one country.
Oh yeah, for sure. They're eyeing the whole world, especially places that are building up fast and shifting to renewables.
The GCC, that seems to be a big focus for them, right? Like we discussed before.
Yep, the Gulf countries. They're investing like crazy in infrastructure, energy, and changing up their economies. That's exactly where a company like Sanghvi Movers Limited thrives. They want to be part of building the future, not just in India, but everywhere.
So it's like a perfect storm, isn't it? The world needs heavy lifting, Everyone's going green, and this company is ready to make it all happen. What a time to be in this business.
Absolutely. Sanghvi Movers Limited story is a great example of what happens when you plan ahead, have a good strategy, and are willing to change with the times. They're not just along for the ride, they're helping steer the ship.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from financials to giant machines. It's been quite a journey. But for you, our listener, what's the takeaway?
I think the big thing is there's always more to the story than we might realize, even in industries we don't think about every day. This company's story shows that innovation can happen anywhere, even in a business that seems pretty traditional. And it shows how those businesses can be a huge part of building a better future for everyone.
That's a great point. And as we wrap up, here's something to think about. Sanghvi Movers Limited is going big into wind energy and expanding into new places like the GCC. What does that tell us about the future of heavy lifting and how it'll shape the world? Keep those wheels turning. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those great questions.